I'm Mary Beth Rivetti, priest associate at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Moscow, Idaho. And I'm here to talk to you today about St. Francis, about trauma, and about hope. You who have been here longer than I have know that this day has always been extraordinary, and certainly within the last decade or so, the liturgy in care of creation has, with the blessing of two bishops, taken place on the Sunday closest to the feast day of St. Francis. In preparing for today, I looked back at where we were a year ago, and of course, a year ago, we had just said goodbye to our rector of 11 years, Mother Robin Biffle, who, as a farewell gift to us all, had planned out a feature-rich worship booklet with music and readings and poetry and all the exuberant, lovely way that Robin had with us in worship. And we were crammed to the gills with animals, human and non, and new babies, Gabriel and Kaylin. So much has changed. And so much has been taken away by this pandemic. So much loss, so much sorrow, and also so much joy. With our vicar, Karen Schomburg, we opened our doors in worship this summer after 5 months of quarantine to baptize a new baby, Charles, who has also attended the Holy Eucharist here upon occasion. Volunteers from St. Mark's just concluded an amazing collaboration with our fellows at the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Palouse in our 7th annual weekend Food for Kids food distribution, with more resources than we could have imagined, with bountiful efforts, with gracious gifts. And this week, a week when my pent-up desire for connection met people eager to make a difference in our community, and together we have met a time for us to stand up and be counted for hope and justice and love. Joy. Joy. We don't have our furries and our scalies and our slimies with us here today, but we will bless them during our Zoom coffee hour at 11:30. And why do we do this? Today is the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, the 13th century mendicant friar, who is so much more than a garden statue, who wrote the first work of literature in Italian, Laudato Si, the Canticle of the Creatures, his version of the morning canticle of creation, the song we know in its English version, All Creatures of Our God and King. In our hymnals, it is hymn number 400, and it's worth looking up because it's easy to miss all the parts of creation that we name in Thanksgiving: wind and day and night, rain and fire, and those who bear pain and sorrow. And even you, O gentle death, waiting to still our final breath. You bring back home the child of God. Francis is so much more than the gentle tamer of the wild wolf of Gubbio, the goofy kid throwing off all his clothes in the middle of the town square to renounce his father's riches. He was also working through trauma. Before his conversion to holy poverty, he did what every red-blooded young man would do and went to war and lost, and was taken prisoner, and was held in a dungeon for over a year. I actually learned that part from one of my Twitter friends, David Peters, an Episcopal priest in Pflugerville, Texas, a former Marine, a former Army chaplain in Iraq, and by his own sheepish admission to me, a former disciple of a certain local pastor. David's book, Post-Traumatic God, talks about not only his experience of returning from combat, but also how he found the work of other theologians who had survived the trauma of war to aid in his recovery. He reads the trauma in Scripture, the trauma of the first generation of the followers of Jesus, witnesses to the crucifixion and the shock of resurrection, the trauma of the early saints, and the trauma of Francis, that prisoner of war who spent a year in the dark wondering whether he would be killed or starve to death or ever see his family again. David writes, "We do not know what Francis endured. No record of his time there exists. Whatever happened, he emerged, like all who come home from war, to resume the life he left. This lasted for a short time. Then, as they will do, another war began, and he proceeded to put his armor on again. It was then that God called him. He embraced this call, renouncing all privilege and comfort. He founded a community devoted to service and the Eucharist. This community here, this nation, this whole world has been going through a very slow motion trauma in this season of COVID, this coronatide. Early on in the pandemic, we reminded ourselves of the need to be grounded, to touch familiar objects, to make contact that would help us to situate ourselves. But lately, it feels so hard to imagine what it will look like on the other side. We have these artificial deadlines. When will the diocesan office see phase 4 again? When is the election? When is the new year? When will there be a vaccine? And some of us may not see the end of this pandemic. Some of us know friends and family who are facing their final moments. Perhaps we join them in praying the prayer that Francis offered each night, often repeating it all night long. Maybe the prayer that he learned in that medieval dungeon. God, who are you? God, who am I? Or the words of the hymn, all you who pain and sorrow bear, cast on God your care. The Franciscan father, Richard Rohr, one of the great teachers about Francis, reminds us that for the great theologians that followed in the steps of Francis, the creation was the first incarnation, God's outpouring of love into finite visible forms. The finite and visible forms we see all around us, in you, in the spider that dropped onto the credence table, in the garden so lovingly tended, and the crops over the rolling hills of the Palouse, and the tender ecological balance of all life on earth that is even now in such dire peril. With my home state of California, the latest, to undergo unbelievable and unquenchable fire. And God poured into the finite and visible form of a virus that has killed 1 million people so far this year, and on its way for more, as well as into the finite and visible form of those who tend the sick and meet the needs of the hungry and poor, and those who are racing to find the right combination of vaccine and treatment, and those who have rushed out a new test that gives us hope for a nearly normal life. All of that wonderful, horrible, beautiful, and sad creation, that is what we lift up today in prayer, in thanksgiving, and in hope. The God who poured love into the creation, that first incarnation, also poured that love into the fully human Jesus, the resurrected one, the one who invites us to join in the feast prepared from before time, the one whose arms are stretched out to embrace us all, 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 all. to bind us in hope, in love, and in the holy kingdom work of God.